So, My Hero Academia manga chapter 350 has been officially released, and in this video, I want to go over the potential of All For One being the most dastardly mastermind in the story of My Hero Academia, and how he may or may not have played a part in how this entire story played out from beginning to end. And you'll see what I'm talking about, but first, right after this. Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Manga Man Drew, and I'm here to do my discussion for My Hero Academia manga chapter 350. And as I said at the beginning of this video, in this video, we are going to be discussing what it means for All For One when it comes to his role in the story, and going into how he may or may not have had his grubby little hands in many aspects of this story, particularly when it comes to his planning and predictions for what was going to happen in the future, as well as how he was able to cultivate or create many of the villains that we've seen in the story, either intentionally or not, and how he had so many plans in play that pretty much put the entire story as we know it into motion, as well as talking about some differences between the official and unofficial translations. So, we will be diving into the discussion soon, but first, let's talk about the differences between the official and unofficial translations. For starters, one main difference between the official and unofficial translations comes from the title of the chapter. Because in the unofficial translations, the title of the chapter is called Flames, but in the official translations, it's called Bound to a Fury Fate, which I think it just seems a little bit more cooler and a little bit more flamboyant in the official translation than in the unofficial. And sticking to this same page, the first difference between the official and unofficial translations comes from Dr. Garaki's dialogue. Because in the unofficial translations, he talks about how All For One and himself were searching for people for a long amount of time, and he was searching for those who were small stunted seeds that are sort of wicked or twisted seeds in themselves. But the difference between what Dr. Garaki says in the unofficial translation in comparison to the official translation is not that different, but a little bit more impactful. And the main difference is that even in the official translation, he brings up the idea that they were searching for these individuals as twisted raw material to eventually be used as vessels for All For One. But the major difference is that in the official translation, they talk about how these twisted raw materials were born into this world. And that's something very interesting, and it's not the last time that we'll see this idea of being born be a concept in the official translation. Because in the next difference between the official and unofficial translations comes from the moment that we see All For One in his suit approaching a burnt up Toya. And it comes from Dr. Garaki in the unofficial translations saying how when it comes to Toya, when it comes to Dabi, that he was going to be another child who had darkness inside of him that would eventually be a vessel for All For One. But Dr. Garaki says that he had this type of darkness inside of him, or that he had everything. But in the official translation, he does bring up the idea that Toya had these cracks that they could use to mold him into a vessel, and that these cracks could have been something else, that it could have been everything as well. But in the official translations, they once again bring up this idea that these cracks were born with him. And that's very important and very crucial, because the idea of him being born with these cracks or being born with these flaws that could have led him to become Dabi in the first place, or be heavily influenced to do wrong, may be an indication of the philosophical or psychological ideals of nature versus nurture. Which one plays a bigger role in shaping who a person is, whether it's what they are born as from birth, from genetics, or how they are raised in an environment that is meant to lift them up or put them down. So I think it's very important that we address the idea of Toya and when it comes to being born the way that they are, because it ties into an idea that maybe that there are certain characters that were just born more susceptible to being villains than others, and that not necessarily being raised the right way would have prevented certain characters from going down the wrong path. So we're going to go into some small differences between the official and unofficial translations. I talked about the main differences that I wanted to bring up, but some smaller ones include that in the unofficial translations, they talk about how they applied a tissue that had been grafted on Dabi to in a way, reconstruct his body. But in the official translations, they talk about how they use regenerative tissue. And this may be important because this story or this moment takes place around 8 to 11 years in the past, which could imply that around that time in the past, they already had regenerative tissues or maybe the regeneration quirk, meaning that they've had this regeneration quirk for a while and that they've been working on this Nomu project for a longer time than we may have thought or anticipated when it comes to high-end Nomu. And then one small difference between the official and unofficial translations comes from the character of Onima. Because in the unofficial translations, you have Onima just complaining about how what is going on is that it's getting too hot in reference to Shoto. But in the official translation, what he is saying is that he's listening to Dabi's story and he's telling Shoto something that he thinks is going on with Dabi, and Shoto confirms what Onima is thinking is that Dabi is planning to kill himself with whatever he's planning on doing. So yeah, those are just a few of the differences between the official and unofficial translations, and I may talk about nature versus nurture in the world of My Hero Academia in a later video, but in this video, let's go over how strategic and how much of a planner All For One is by going through some instances where he was able to predict or plan things in advance that have had major repercussions on the story as a whole. So let's start off probably with the most impactful planning that All For One ever did in the story, and it involves what he did to Shigaraki, or more specifically, how he used Shigaraki to mess with All Might. Because the first instances that we saw that All For One was this kind of Machiavellian schemer and how he had multiple plans set in place was when we are first properly introduced to him in the Camino arc, where he talks about how he predicted that All Might would come and stop him when he attacked the other pro heroes. But the key point showing how much of a mastermind and really sadistic person that he is how he reveals to All Might that Shigaraki is Nana Shimura's grandson, the grandson of All Might's mentor. And this is a very big reveal, not because it messes with All Might and forcing him to have to make a choice of fighting Shigaraki, which is a family member of someone that he loved and cared about, but also shows him that there was someone that he was unable to save. And what makes it even worse is that this most likely ties into one of All For One's bigger plans of using Shigaraki and his hatred so that he could potentially live on forever, and that him being the grandson of Nana Shimura, someone that was one of his arch enemies and is related to All Might as a mentor, just makes it even more heartbreaking and show how much of an evil manipulator and planner All For One is. And then another thing that actually happens around this same arc that may also entail how much of a planner All For One is that he could have potentially planned for himself to get caught. Because we don't definitively know if he was planning on allowing himself to be caught, but what we do know is that he knew that him being caught would be beneficial to his plan, or more specifically to the growth of Shigaraki. Because as we've seen him being taken into Tartarus, he begins to monologue to himself about how that even though he's being put in prison, that is actually a benefit because it means that Shigaraki would be able to grow on his own. And that All Might's living may have done more harm to Deku than it would have benefited him. And as we see later on, the fact that he is in jail is very beneficial to the villains because not only does it lead to Shigaraki breaking him out of prison, which could have also been a part of All For One's plan, but it also allowed All For One himself to set free the Tartarus villains as well as other prisoners, which would have made it harder for the heroes to try and find him, which was also a part of his plan as well. So there are many instances showing that All For One is very much a meticulous individual when it comes to his planning, but he's also very good at making predictions about the world without having any knowledge prior. For instance, in chapter 116, All For One pretty much gives an accurate depiction of what is going on outside of this world with no prior information being provided to him, because no information about the outside world can be provided to him. So everything that he said and everything that was accurate about what he said was based off of his own predictions, which shows that this could have potentially just been all a part of his plan to try and take down All Might, but also to bolster up Shigaraki for his greater and more ultimate plan. And what's even more interesting is that even after we've had hundreds of chapters of not having All For One in the story, that as soon as he makes a more proper introduction into the story as being a part of Shigaraki, that is where we get the confirmation of why Shigaraki was specifically chosen to be sort of the vessel of All For One. Because All For One knew he couldn't steal One For All, so he decided that he was going to use Shigaraki as a form of stealing One For All by cultivating his hatred. And we'll get more into that a little bit later for how he was able to do that. But like I said, we even saw in chapter 297 how he potentially set up the fact that Shigaraki with All For One was going to be used to break himself out of jail. But we also see him being able to predict the actions of other people once again when he predicts in chapter 312 how Deku was going to leave UA, be on his own, and working alongside other pro heroes. As well, he also predicted that Lady Nagant would betray him and that this would set up a domino effect that would lead Deku to leaving the other pro heroes, being on his own, running himself ragged to the points where he could be picked up by even weaker and lower level assassins or warriors or villains and bring him to All For One. So yeah, All For One has shown to be very strategic and very methodical with his planning, even to the point from once he's freed from Tartarus and sent the villains out to try and cause havoc in Japan, he also had a secondary goal to prevent them. He had the secondary reason for the villains being escaped and the convicts being loose to distract the heroes so that they are unable to track him. As well as he apparently has friends all around the world causing havoc as well, as seen in chapter 329, which is also a part of his plan to prevent other heroes from other countries from coming to the aid of Japan. And you may be thinking that, yeah, that could be possible, but maybe it's just a coincidence. Well, no, because in chapter 335, it is confirmed that when it comes to All For One and his planning, that he always has different roadmaps and different paths to achieve a singular goal. And when one path fails, he has other multiple paths that he could take to arrive at the same goal. Which is even more confirmed in the most recent chapter with the idea that a character like Dabi was going to be a secondary vessel if something were to happen to Shigaraki. And we see even more about how All For One is so strategic and meticulous in his planning when it comes to the traitor at UA. Because it is revealed also in chapter 333 that not only does All For One have multiple paths to lead to his one goal, but in the same chapter, he brings up the fact that he has quote unquote friends to spare, and how that was referring to the UA traitor, which is, spoilers, revealed to be Aoyama, and that even when Deku returned back to UA, he planned on using Aoyama as a traitor to try and push Deku out of UA to make it easier for him to be captured by All For One. But the fact that he brings up this idea that he has quote unquote friends and not just one friend could imply that he also had multiple moles planted at UA, which in chapter 342 is confirmed to be true, as we see that he has multiple people inside of UA whose goal was once again to lure Deku out of UA to make it easier for All For One to capture Deku. So yeah, the story has shown multiple times that when it comes to All For One and when it comes to planning, he's very precise at doing it, and that when one plan fails, he has 12 others in the sidelines. But that doesn't mean that his plans haven't failed, it's just that he has so many smaller plans in place that one failure doesn't really set him back. So yeah, we've seen how strategic All For One is when it comes to his planning, but let's talk more about the influences that All For One has had on the bigger story, more specifically, the influence that he has had on multiple characters, because we've seen that in chapter 350, All For One was a part of Dabi's flashback. It is revealed that in this most recent chapter, the character that we see picking up a charred body of Toya was actually All For One. And with this piece of information that is pretty much confirmed, we can also secondarily confirm that the man with the hat and the black suit that was allowing for Tinko to return back to his family and gave him back to his mother was also All For One, which shows that All For One was also most likely than not keeping tabs on Nana Shimura's family, which was the exact reasoning why she gave up her family in the first place. And there is a theory that most likely All For One gave Shigaraki DK, which is a possibility, but it's also a possibility that he was just going to use Shigaraki anyway, just to spite All Might. So yeah, that's another piece of confirmation of All For One being influential in the creation of 2 villains, but it's very possible that he was involved in the creation of a 3rd villain via Overhaul. Because in this chapter, it is revealed that All For One had multiple plans in place for the off chance that Shigaraki fails as a vessel, that he would have multiple candidates to be vessels. One of them was Dabi. We get to see 2 other female characters at this facility, but another possibility is Overhaul, and that could be seen in his flashback when he's a child. Because if you look closely at Overhaul in this panel, you'll see that the surroundings that he is in is very similar to the surroundings of the orphanage that we see in this chapter, down to the spaceships, the tiling, and even the walls themselves and the tree in the corner. So it's very likely that All For One took on Overhaul when he was an orphan and was planning on using him as a secondary or a spare vessel in the off chance that Shigaraki goes awry. And that potentially, because Dabi set the orphanage on fire, this set in motion for Overhaul to be picked up by the Yakuza, which would lead to what we saw in the story of My Hero Academia when it comes to the Shi Hisakai arc in My Hero Academia. So yeah, we've seen just All For One's existence has heavily influenced the story as a whole. And let's not forget that All For One is the reason why One For All was even created in the first place. So the fact that if All For One never existed, the story as we currently have it would not exist at all, which shows how much of a crucial aspect All For One plays in the story of My Hero Academia, and that's pretty cool in my opinion. So yeah, that's all I really want to talk about in this video, particularly just showing how much of a strategic individual All For One is, and how much of an influence that All For One has had, not just on the characters, but on the story of My Hero Academia. So let me ask you, do you like the fact that All For One has such a great influence on the story of My Hero Academia, or do you hate it? Do you enjoy All For One as a character, or do you just despise him? Leave your thoughts down in the comments down below. I would love to read them. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel to get more content like this, where I talk about My Hero Academia through discussions, spoilers, and reviews. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!